Christina Dawkins did her BA in Northwestern and her master's in Columbia at the Human Rights Program there. She was program manager of Justice in Education, that's what it's called, right? The Justice in Education Initiative at Columbia, and then director of the Civic Engagement and Social Justice at the New School. And she has taught in universities at Brown, at John Jay, I think I saw there. So you can read up on biographies anywhere. But the important thing is actually the thing we were talking about last night, that she has gone out of academia, which I find always fascinating, that people have the nerve to leave academia and try the real world and try doing things and thinking about things and perhaps changing things in the real world. She founded A4Abolitionist social justice consultancy, and she consults. People want to hear about how they can do better engaging in things to do with social justice, also the Abolition Project, it says there. And I really encourage you to look up the website where there is a description and explanation of the things that she does. We had the wonderful opportunity to hear her yesterday on trafficking, and today she is going to be a part of this panel. And I wonder if it'll be repetition or if we'll go into new things. We will be talking, we will be really, okay. So, and Linda, I'll introduce you now so that then we can go into the discussion without stopping for formalities. Linda Meyer is from our own law school. I always brag that she is not just a law scholar, she's a philosopher. And her book, The Justice of Mercy, is one of the books, I think, that puts together law and philosophy in a way that few people can aspire to. Can I say that it's a sad book? Okay, it's a sad book, and altogether I think we might talk at the end about the fact that we've been spending 3 days talking about very sad things, and it's wonderful to have Mohammed Elahi here because he succeeds every time he introduces or talks or asks a question in telling us that maybe this is not all sad and maybe there is something to uphold our sense of hope somehow. So Mohammed, really I want to thank you already now for yesterday and the day before for that shot of people who are using the word hope or optimism. I don't go that far, not hope or optimism, but just the fact that we can't, while discussing these things, be so low all the time. So there's something about these discussions that is making us perhaps think of change in a somewhat realistic way. All right, so back to Linda, sorry. So except for that wonderful book, The Justice of Mercy, she did her JD, is it? JD and PhD at Berkeley, and clerked for, among others, Sandra Day O'Connor at the Supreme Court. I was looking at the courses that you teach, Linda, and I found, of course, I immediately gravitate to the ones that I think of as so important. So, of course, constitutional law, all right, and criminal law. Everybody talks about that. But then international law, or legal theory, or theories of punishment. These are the kinds of things in the law schools that I always go to just try to hear something less procedural and more essential in what we're doing. Here on campus, it's been now 4 or 5 years, I think, longer. I thought it was 2014 maybe, or 15, that Linda began the program on teaching in the prisons.
2011.
2011, that far away, okay, because I thought it was 2014. All right, wonderful, 2011. Quinnipiac is active in that. We've got people from different disciplines and different schools joining in that project. And again, when you look at an institution and you see that kind of interest and that kind of leadership in that kind of interest, you do get a few grains of hope in what you're doing in these very academic and closed environments that some of us find ourselves in. So, I'm now going to turn it over to Christina. Is this going to be fun doing this? Maybe if you play with it, it'll be okay.
Now that we get
Okay. And I'm going to sit over there so I can see the shirt too.
Okay. All right.
I'm going to try to turn off this light nevertheless, hoping it won't do anything. Is that me? No.
Yeah.
No?
Now on.
All right. Okay. All right, so good morning, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. And yes, this is not going to be the same talk that I gave yesterday, in case it was right. It's going to be different, but I am going to start the same way by saying that I am an abolitionist because slavery is very much alive today, and to prime you that you're going to get a conversation about radicalism and radical change. So yesterday I talked about the abolition of human trafficking, and today I'm going to talk about prison abolition, which is a different form of modern-day slavery. So this is all going to be couched from the U.S. perspective, and I was reminded that we have an international audience, so I'm going to give them a lot of context into what mass incarceration looks like in the United States and how it came to be, and how it's very much fitting in this talk about race and inequality. What I want to start with is this artist, Kehinde Wiley, created this 30-foot tall sculpture called Rumors of War, and it was unveiled in Times Square just a few weeks ago, and this was printed in the New York Times. It's not going to be in Times Square. It's actually going to be permanently in Virginia, where there are still 10 Confederate soldier statues, monuments, celebrating the Confederacy, celebrating genocide and killing and racism, heroes to that cause. So this is actually going to be placed alongside them. So what he did was he took a classic image of this hero on horseback and put a different person on it. When it was unveiled, there was silence, because it was something brand new that we've actually never seen this face, this look, those shoes on a sculpture on a horse. And so he was doing something really, really radical, really powerful that actually just needed to sink in. So I want to talk about how art and education can be used for radical change in this conversation. So I want to start with that. I'm going to use a few quotes, but this is the quote that's going to frame my conversation here. It says, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." Audre Lorde she self-describes as a woman of color, lesbian, poet, artist, activist. She really, for a lot of women of color, especially in the United States, helped us understand our own identities through her poetry, her feminism, her talks. She gave this talk at a women's convention where she was the only woman of color speaker, and sort of challenged the tokenism of having her there. So the longer quote is, "For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change." So I want to think about this quote and posit the possible inadequacy of reform and the necessity for radical change and abolition. So she said this in 1979, by the way, and it asks the question, can you get rid of something by using the same tools that created it? And that's what I want us to think about. So this is the 13th Amendment in its totality. The 13th Amendment is the amendment that is commonly talked about to have abolished slavery. But this is how it reads: "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." So the 13th Amendment didn't actually abolish slavery. It changed it into crime. So you are not chattel slave, but if you have the label criminal, you can be enslaved in the United States. So now, instead of the practice of chattel slavery means based on your categorization, you are enslaved for a lifetime and your descendants are enslaved. That's how chattel slavery is different from forms of modern day slavery. So now the state, as we all know, hyper-criminalizes and persecutes people of color and marginalized populations. So that is what has now been described as the new Jim Crow. And I want to take just a quick poll, just so I know whether I should really delve into this. How many people, has anyone read the new Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander's book? Okay. Seen Ava DuVernay's 13th? Yeah, okay. So I'm going to talk about it a little bit, because we have people from all over. So basically, it's the timeline where you go from chattel slavery, and you have the 13th Amendment, and so you move from things like convict leasing, where if a black man is loitering, he'll be arrested and then put to work camps. It's right back to the field is exactly the cycle of it. And so convict leasing then went away, and we had different things popping up like Jim Crow laws. And then we moved from Jim Crow laws to Reagan and Nixon and Clinton's policies that really built up mass incarceration. So I'm going to go into that a little bit more. So Jim Crow was a series of state laws that allowed for racial segregation and discrimination from 1877 to 1964. Mass incarceration explains the giant boom where the United States incarcerates 2.2 million people, and 4.7 million people are on parole or probation, so they're still under state control and surveillance, which represents 22% of the world's incarcerated population. So those are the key figures for mass incarceration in the United States. So I talked about this yesterday, a bit, how mass incarceration was in part as a way to save poor rural towns by replacing closing factories with prisons. And so it was really sort of trying to solve white poverty by arresting black and brown bodies. That was the trade-off. It actually hasn't been working very well, shocking, but it sold well. The narrative really sold well and resonated in sort of dog whistle politics, where you're trying to stir get people to do something for a racist motivation without calling it racism, is what dog whistle politics is referring to. So this is the prison industrial complex. Don't try to read this whole graph, but I think the key figure here is that an annual total of $182 billion goes into this prison industrial complex. Public corrections agencies, judicial and legal systems, public employees, healthcare inside, policing is $63.2 billion every year. And you have all of these private prison profits, utilities, food. This is a major industry in the United States. And all of that put together is what the prison industrial complex is referring to. So it goes beyond the physical jails and prisons. So incarceration is one piece of this, but you see 3.6 million people are currently on probation, and almost 1 million people are on parole. Probation is typically federal. We don't have to do county, state, federal stuff, but it's really just that there are 7 million people that are still under the U.S. justice system, which is a really significant part of the population. So this is how the United States criminalizes poverty, which is it's very tied to race, but the key thing is that many people are locked up simply because they cannot afford bail, or they plead guilty, they take a plea bargain. Oh,
I've lost them.
all right.
Why is
Yeah.
that?
All right, I'm just, thank you.
Is it you?
Just signal, wave to me if it's way. But this is, more than half of people are detained in local jails simply because they can't afford bail. The median bail amount is $10,000, and most people who are locked up for not affording bail don't make $10,000 in the entire year. They make less than $10,000 per year, so there was never any way they were going to afford bail. And so it's really criminalizing poverty through our lack of being able to provide a speedy trial. People will be in jail for 2 years. I know someone who was in Rikers for 4 years. This is not being convicted of a crime, but being held. So there are many ways that the United States is making incarceration and the prison industrial complex really grow and boom. Another key thing is the school to prison pipeline, which is also very tied to poverty. Poor schools tend to be militarized, where if someone gets into a fight at school, instead of being suspended or instead of going to the principal's office, they'll get suspended or expelled. Instead of trying to solve a conflict, they'll call the police and children will be arrested. I'm talking like children as young as 5 years old police will be called and will be pushed into the system where once you're inside, it's like a revolving door. It's very hard to get out. It's kind of, maybe you can read it. It's kind of tiny, so I'm going to say it out loud. 61% of the incarcerated population is Black or Latino, and whereas Black and Latinx folks represent only 30% of the U.S. population. So out of 3 African American males, 1 out of 3 African American males will be incarcerated in his lifetime, 1 out of 6 Latino males. So there is an issue of, this is not because the rate of crime is higher in these populations, it's the rate of supervision, of surveillance, and of arrest. It's very different whether you're, we're on a college campus, and I think for honest, if the police were to raid a frat house, they'd find more drugs than they were to raid a public housing project. It's very, but they're not raiding the frat houses. They're not raiding the dorms because that's not who they want to lock up. That's not who they're interested in surveilling and controlling. So that's how it starts at a very young age and then continues. So these are just a few statistics to really drive home the connection between poverty, race, and incarceration. Black people use drugs at roughly the same rate as white people, but are 3 to 5 times more likely to get arrested. And I also want to point out that even the way that drugs are criminalized has a racial aspect to it. If you remember crack versus cocaine sentencing, crack sentencing used to get 40 times longer sentencing than cocaine. Cocaine is more associated with the white community and crack is more associated with the Black community. Clinton came in and reduced that to 9 or 11 times the likelihood, which is better, but really doesn't, there's still a racial disparity in how drugs are addressed. And I think the current example would be the opioid crisis in the United States is being treated as a medical crisis. And that I believe it's directly because it affects the white community in a way that people find our response needs to be care and treatment rather than criminalization. But you see the opioid crisis is not being applied to other drugs. It's not being applied to crack addiction or to other types of addiction. It's staying a medical crisis and not being criminalized, and the same can't be said for other drugs. These are just a couple more. African Americans are incarcerated 6 times the rate of white people. And the key here for why this is the new Jim Crow for me is that there are 50,000 ways to legally discriminate against people once you have a criminal record that follows you throughout your life. People talk about paying your debt to society, but it's not paid. It continues throughout your lifetime. You can be discriminated with housing, with education, with jobs, and I think a really key thing is disenfranchisement. You lose the right to vote. Those laws are starting to change in certain states slowly, but many people, once you've committed a felony, you lose the right to vote for your life. So a book that I highly recommend, if you haven't read it already, is Angela Davis's Are Prisons Obsolete? It's really powerful, and I'm going to read a quote from her. She says, "If we're willing to take seriously the consequences of racist and class-biased justice system, we will reach the conclusion that enormous numbers of people are in prison simply because they are, for example, Black, Chicano, Vietnamese, Native American, or poor, regardless of their ethnic background. They are sent to prison not so much because of the crimes they may have indeed committed, but largely because their communities have been criminalized." So that's the key in understanding how the criminal justice system in the United States is very much an extension of slavery, not only because it's codified in the Constitution, but because that's how it's practiced in current policing. So that brings me to why I take a radical approach to addressing these types of injustices. So this is, again, the statue by Kehinde Wiley. He's actually the artist who did the portrait of Obama. He did the official presidential portrait. And this is a statue of Robert E. Lee, who is a hero of the Confederacy, and that is currently in Virginia. So the City Council of Charlottesville voted in 2017 to remove the statue of Robert E. Lee and rename Lee Park Emancipation Park. This led to a white supremacist rally called Unite the Right. That was a Freudian slip. Unite the Right. And unfortunately, there were 3 fatalities. That's how big the backlash was. So that instead, a lawsuit resolved in 2018 prohibiting the city from not only removing the statue, but also forbidding them from adding any context. So leaving the statue up, they actually just wanted to actually put a plaque saying, the Confederacy was fighting to maintain slavery, just a little bit of context. No, that was prohibited from doing that. And so this is where it points out just how much the racist ideology is alive and well and protected in our legal systems, and the necessity to not only try to remove these things, but replace them with other images, because we actually need to have in our imaginations that other images can exist, beyond removing harmful ones. So I think of radicalism as exercising our creativity to deconstruct systems and institutions that house oppression and rebuild new ones that weren't based on a foundation that we don't actually want to live in anymore. And if you think about it, that's really all the colonizers did, right? Race is a social construct. They came up with it. They spread the idea in order to get things that they wanted, like power and hegemony, and create othering of certain people and keeping themselves as default. The default human is a white male with wealth and property. This is still how we sort of see the world, and we have to shift that. But they just started out as ideas that have caught on, which is an oversimplification, but at its heart, at its core, that really, it is just an idea. So there is a need for radical change, because when we talk about criminal justice reform, we're reforming something that is based on a racist system. We're reforming something that actually, when people talk about trying to fix the criminal justice system, it's actually working correctly. No part of it is performing badly. It is locking up people of color. it is locking up poor people. It is locking up people with mental illnesses, with mental health care challenges that we don't want to see. You know, it's cleaning up the others and leaving in society the people who are, who had the power the whole time. Yeah, okay. And so literally reform means to reshape, and it's where you seek to improve something without fundamentally changing the original quality or intent. And we've been trying to do this for 100 years, and we have mass incarceration. So where black bodies are enslaved at a greater height than at the height of the transatlantic slave trade. In 1850, more black men are in prison today than were enslaved in 1850. That's from Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. And I want to tell you a quote that a friend and colleague of mine, his name's Jay Borchert. He's the co-founder and director of the formerly incarcerated College Graduates Network. He's a really interesting guy. But he explains it like this. Historically, we have played this game of whack-a-mole, where we just smash symptoms. Now we're whacking away at mass incarceration, and we got to knock that out. But something else punitive is going to pop up, especially if we don't reckon with racism and get a reality check on capitalism. So whack-a-mole, in case you're not familiar with the game, so you like whack something and then something else pops up, you have to whack it, and that's what reform is trying to do. The Marshall Project is a really wonderful resource for learning about what's going on in the world and around criminal justice, and they have a page dedicated to all the Democratic candidates and their stances on reform. And my issue with it is that there's like 12 stances to have, but no one's really questioning prison abolition. You know, it's like, where do you stand? Like, how many people would you pardon? And it's like, oh, I would pardon everyone with nonviolent drug offenses. I would pardon everyone with this. It's like, but pardoning is an exception to the rule. You're keeping the rules, right? Mm-hmm. Like, clemency is a carryover from monarchical times. It's not even a democratic practice. And it's this question of, I'm going to pardon 10,000 people. I'm going to pardon 20,000. But you're not going to change the system. And so there's this really long page with all of these different criminal justice reforms without actually tackling maybe the issue is the system itself. So that's basically my case for abolition and needing to dismantle the social constructs. So I'm going to just wrap up with some work that I'm doing currently. And that's working with artists and activists to create radical programs to try to address these types of systemic issues. My current project is my attempt to deinstitutionalize education by having a live online course where you can learn about program design if you have an idea. Artists and educators will take the course, and I call it A Sea Change, is from Shakespeare, and it's about a radical change or transformation. And it's teaching these principles for radical program design to whoever's interested. Because I really believe that whoever's part of the problem needs to be part of the solution. But often things like fear or inadequacy, maybe you think you have to be a professional activist or to have a bunch of degrees or some institutional validation to actually make a change, but I really believe that everybody can make a change if they have the tools to design it, to go for it in that way. And so that's part of my leaving the institution was to really challenge the idea that you need an institution behind you in order to do something significant. So I'm going to wrap up with my favorite symbol of peace, which is this. This is a bronze statue of Bruce Lee, and it was erected in 2005 in Bosnia, which is the site of this horrific bloodshed and conflict. And afterward, they had to decide these two sides. It was the Catholic Croats and Muslim Bosniaks. The conflict ended. The two sides wanted to build some statue for coming together and ending violence. And all of these images were discussed, like symbols, former presidents, Gandhi, the Pope, and they ended up with Bruce Lee. And the reason was, that's what they said, that's the only thing they had in common, that they could find in common, is that they all grew up watching the same kung fu fighting hero. And that was, oh, look, we have something in common. We're the same people. We can come together and coexist as one. And so that is, I learned that story when I was studying human rights and acting technique at the same time. And I had this idea in my head that human rights and art, it goes together, but I wasn't quite sure how or why, and this is what brought it together for me. So that's what really fuels my practice, and this is just a slide for keeping in touch.